Hello and welcome to the Mr. Pancake YouTube channel. Wait, that's wrong. How do I keep messing this up? Anyways, welcome to the Mr. 50mm YouTube channel. I'm Chris. Today we're going to be doing a bunch of first impressions on a couple pancake lenses. I've got these lenses over the past couple months and therefore I've got the chance to kind of shoot them and get to use them for a little while, and I just wanted to make this video. So this won't be an in-depth review, more of a rapid-fire quick take. Well, rapid for me. I'm gonna guess that this might still end up being a bit of a long video. At any rate, over the past little while, I've come to enjoy playing with flat objects and appreciate their lack of intrusion. And to introduce the first lens that we're gonna talk about, I will hold it up now. It's the Viltrox Chip. It's going to be the only lens of the batch that involves having autofocus, and the one I have is obviously the E-mount variant. Fun fact, it's also going to be the lightest lens of the trio that we're going to look at today. Next up, I have the 7 Artisans 35mm f5.6 M-mount lens. This is obviously a manual focus lens, and I think it has a pretty striking design. Lastly, we're going to be having a look at the Brighten 28mm f2.8, again M-mount lens. And I also think this is a pretty striking design. This lens is also the most expensive of the batch. Additionally, for the M-mount lenses, we're going to be mainly shooting these via the perspective of a mirrorless camera, my A7 II. And before we dive into the video, I do want to say this is not a sponsored piece by any of the firms that made these lenses. I bought these lenses with my own cash dollars, sadly. With that, let's get into it. The Chip. This is a natively E-mount lens, at least the version that I got. It features autofocus using voice coil motor technology, and it's easily the lightest lens of the batch, coming in at 40 grams. And this lens retails for just $99 US at the time of writing the script, which is in October of 2025. When I think back to when this lens was released on the 24th of September, 2024, this was easily one of the more hyped lenses of the year. And part of that is just due to the nature of the lens, being a pancake lens, super tiny, being fairly cheap. It generated quite a lot of excitement for Viltrox. And I'll be honest, I think the Chip is pretty awesome given its size. Autofocus on this lens is reasonable. It's not super swift. In fact, you might be fooled into thinking that just because it has a VCM motor, that it's super duper fast, that you can basically track any object. I would park that expectation here. I'm just guessing that the voice coil motor in this probably isn't the biggest, baddest unit, more like a pretty okay, agile hamster on a hamster wheel. It is sometimes a bit dopey, but very cute. I apologize. I'm not really sure where I was going with this analogy. Anyways, in low light, with my A7 II at least, the Chip does at times struggle to attain focus. I do find that on my A7 III, this is better. Either way, it's impressive that there's an autofocus motor on this lens at all. And yeah, that's one of the key things about it. Now, when you look at this lens, you'll notice that there isn't much to it. You really just have this little switch to open up the lens cover, and that's literally it. There's no manual focus ring, there's no aperture control, and that's because you can't change aperture on this, and there's no magic customizable function button. That said, its lack of things is made up for by its smallness. The lens itself barely extends. Actually, to me, it doesn't extend beyond the grip of the A7 II, which means that with this lens on the A7 II, the whole combo is incredibly compact, almost pocketable if you have giant pockets. And what does this compactness actually mean? I actually don't know, but I do know that the combo is fun to use. I really liked using this lens. One thing I will kind of comment on though is I kind of routinely forgot to open the lens cover, so I would power on the camera and just be greeted with black. Apparently, this hasn't been seared into my brain yet. Apparently, my brain is hard to sear. Possibly it's a very wet brain. Overall, image quality-wise, the Viltrox chip is pretty solid, especially if you're just looking at things in the center. Things do get a bit dicey when you leave the center, and the corners do get a bit smudgy, but it's a $99 lens. Things to remember and watch out for if you're looking for this lens though, is that if the lens is not actively being powered, the rear elements will actually move about. And it's not normally an issue, but just don't forget to always have a rear cap on the chip, as it does actually move back far enough that the rear element might actually make contact with something that may ding it if you're not careful. So just don't set it out in random areas. Additionally, remember that one of the things that got axed from this lens design is aperture control. So the lens is a 28mm f4.5, and that's all you get all day, every day. There's no stopping down, and yeah, 4.5 is what you get. Lastly, if you are looking to accompany one of these lenses with the older Sony Nex cameras, Viltrox has said the chip does not work properly on Nex cameras. When I tried it on my Nex 3, it just straight up doesn't boot. Which is kind of sad because the Nex 3 is also a very tiny camera and it would have been a pretty cool combo, but it is an ancient camera. All that said, again, I still think the lens is super cool, and at $99, easily worth picking up to play with. Easy recommendation in my opinion. Let's have a look at some sample photos. The 7 Artisans 35mm f5.6 M mount. This lens also comes in at $99 dues. Such a bargain. And it actually comes in multiple mounts as well, aside from M. You can actually get it in native E mount, Z mount, and L mount variants. But as I said, I have the M mount one, so I'm using it on an adapter. Mainly so that I can, if I want to, chunk it on actual rangefinder camera, should I choose to do that. When you first get this lens, the one thing that really jumps at you is, aside from its looks, how heavy the lens actually is. It's not the heaviest thing in the world, but it is dense. And this comes in at around 130 grams. That is 3 chips. A little more than 3 chips. Dang, that's some weight. So what do you get for this weight? Turns out, not much. Like the chip, there is a switch that opens up a lens cap. Pretty sweet. And it doubles as your focusing knob. Pretty cool. And expected since it is a manual focus lens. You might also expect aperture control, but like the Chip, this is a fixed f5.6 lens, so no aperture control here. But what else is there? Again, you get a pretty striking lens design. And I know, I said the Brighten Star is also pretty striking, but I honestly think this is more strikeage. I don't think another lens that looks like this 7 Artisans Pancake. Now, being that I got the M mount variant, you would think, hey, does this couple onto the rangefinder so you can actually range find using the rangefinder window? No. If you use it on rangefinder, it's expected that you're actually meant to zone focus the lens or use live view. And luckily at f5.6 at 35 millimeters, you can actually zone focus this okay. Additionally, the focus throw on the lens is fairly short, so it's pretty easy to slide your focus where you need it to get to. That being said, when I was shooting this, I actually kind of used it on my TechArt EA7, so I got autofocus on it anyways. Yay! I found that the images that this lens makes are actually overall fairly sharp. The center of the frame is honestly pretty brilliant, and especially at closer distances, the lens performs surprisingly well. I also generally like the way that it overall renders colors, and I do want to point out that I did notice though on my A7 II, there was some color shiftage at the edge of the frame, but it's not that unexpected given the type of lens. Additionally, the edges of the frame were also susceptible to distortion. That being said, this lens focuses surprisingly close, so despite the f5.6 f-ness of the camera, of the lens, you can get some background blurrage. Overall, I find this lens though to be a bit confusing. I don't mind the fixed aperture and I like the funky look, but the lack of rangefinder coupling honestly kind of sucks. This thing looks awesome on an M camera, but personally, I'm not that comfortable with zone focusing. I don't find it too bad, but I don't normally go out intending to shoot zone focusing. And if I were to zone focus, I personally would actually want to do something even wider than 35. Something like my 21mm Voigtlander is probably where I'd be a little more comfortable. But do I recommend this lens? Anyways, I think it's a soft recommendation. It's a fun lens if you're okay with all the limitations, like the lack of coupling to M cameras and the fixed aperture. And for the price, it's honestly a pretty neat lens anyways. But yeah, I definitely don't think I'd recommend it over the Viltrox if you're just looking for something fun to play with on E-mount. But let's have a look at the sample gallery. The Brighten Star 28mm f2.8 X Slim Pro M. It's a long name. But this lens is an amazingly stylish lens. The lens you can see is a gloss black finish lens, and it's a ultra low profile lens. Let's have a look at it on my DIY rangefinder. It also barely extends above the grip of this camera. And it's, I think, one of the thinnest M-mount lenses that I personally own to date. And might be generally being one of the thinnest M-mount lenses around. With The only other ones that come to mind being ones from the company MS Optic. Now, this lens isn't particularly crazy expensive, but it is if you compare it to the first two lenses that we looked at. I got mine during one of the AliExpress sales that happen extremely frequently, and it came out to around 350 Canadian buckaroos, or roughly 250 US dollars. And in the grand scheme of M-mount lenses, that's actually not too bad. For the money, you get quite a lot though. This is 125 grams of glossy lens glory. This lens does couple with the rangefinder, so if you are planning to shoot it on a M-mount camera, you can focus with it. There are some issues though that I found. The lens, well, I didn't just find it, I also read about it, and it's been mentioned in other reviews, and I also observed it. But there is substantial focus shift when you stop down on the lens. And I actually found it to be kind of annoying. On my DIY M-mount rangefinder, I found that at f2.8, things were hunky-dory. But if I stopped down to f4 to 5.6, things got a bit wonky, and depending on where my subject was, the increased depth wasn't necessarily enough to compensate for where the focus shifted when stopping down. That said, when shooting it on a mirrorless camera like the A7 II, that's not a problem, as you're looking through the lens via the EVF anyways, and you'll just be able to focus one way or another. It is more of a problem on actual rangefinders. Otherwise, the lens itself is very sharp in the center and in the mid frame. The corners do get janky, and they don't improve much when stopping down. This is apparently a product of lens field curvature. Additionally though, even though you do have aperture control on this lens, it is very kind of fiddly and uncomfortable, and it's not clicked either, so you can't really tell by feel alone where the aperture is. But I will say otherwise, focusing on this lens with the focusing tab is quite joyous. I did like it. Lastly, this lens comes with a very annoying lens cover. It's this thing here, and for some reason, it's a screw-on lens cap, and it's kind of fiddly. It's a very small little cap, and I personally would have preferred if it was just some sort of pinch style cap instead of this screw-on jobby. Overall though, I would actually recommend this lens, whether or not you are adapting it for a mirrorless camera or if you're going to use it on an M-mount camera. Although I would actually prefer, I'd recommend it for mirrorless more than M-mount, just because the focus shift did actually annoy me quite a bit. And when you adapt it on a mirrorless camera, that becomes a lot less of a problem, since you're going to be staring through the EVS and you can probably see and accommodate the shift a little bit better. I will say though, when you do adapt it to a mirrorless camera, like with the 7 Artisans lens, you will have a bit of the adapter tube there, kind of reducing the super cool thin profile of this lens. But it's still quite awesome. Now let's take a bit of a detour and talk about, again, the shooting experience via my DIY rangefinder. Again, or not again, but if you want to explore building your own DIY digital rangefinder, I'll link to that below and put a thingamajigger up here if you're interested. But otherwise, back to the actual lens that we have here, the Brighten Star. Again, this was a little more frustrating to shoot on this camera, and in general, when things were wide open, again, the focus was good, but when stopping down, the focus shift would actually throw things off more often than not. And it's not actually too terrible if you're shooting static objects, since on this camera, I could at least take my rear LCD cover off and double check the focus there, but it does complicate things if you're trying to do some run and gun shooting real quick. For actual rangefinder users on film, I think I'd probably want to be even more aware of the focus shifts, and therefore using it on a rangefinder would, I think, still be a bit of a weird thing for me to recommend, just because, again, I personally found that the focus shift impacted the way that I was shooting. But either way, with the lens on an actual rangefinder, I did find that the lens itself usually looked pretty awesome. And I'm gonna guess that if you're shooting on a film rangefinder, you might not notice the focus shift as much, just due to the fact that the film itself will be a little more forgiving depending on your scanner and film grain and whatnot. Even with the focus shifts, I still think that this is a lens that's worth considering on a rangefinder. And part of that, or most of that, is the incredible thinness of the profile of the lens when it's mounted on an actual M-mount camera. As you can see, this thing barely sticks up above the mount, and that might be a big factor for you if you're trying to pack as light as possible. And again, it might be worth shooting through and figuring out and see if you can adapt to the focus shift just to have something this compact. Conclusion. How do we end this? Well, I'll just come out and say it. I personally enjoyed the Brighten Star the most of the three lenses. And I know it's on my DIY rangefinder, but I actually enjoyed shooting the Brighten Star the most on my A7 II. Next, my next favorite lens would be the Viltrox Chip. And lastly, it would be then the 7 Artisans. Now, that's not to say that the Viltrox or the 7 Artisans were bad, but to me, the Brighten Star took the show with all its compactness and the fact that it actually had proper rangefinder coupling and actual aperture controls. All of that's pretty nuts. In spite of the fact that of the three lenses, it is the most expensive. But in the in the grand scheme of things for an M-mount lens, it's really not too bad. That being said, if someone were to ask me which of the lenses would I recommend generally, it would probably actually be the Viltrox Chip. It is extremely lightweight, it actually has autofocus, and it is cheap as chips. What more could you ask for? Now, the 7 Artisans I found to be the most confusing lens of the bunch. Sure, it's cheap and it makes actually pretty good photos, but the lack of RF coupling was a bit of a letdown, and its heft was a little bit confusing considering that it is similarly hefty as the Brighten Star, but a lot less generally capable. But the design is very striking. But that's all I got for this video. Let me know which of these pancakes do you like. And before we end it, I do want to say there's another pancake lens that we didn't talk about in this video that I think should get an honorable mention. The Canon EF 40mm f2.8. That thing is excellent and might actually get its own video later on. Otherwise, let me know in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Maybe a super thanks if you're into that. Till next time, bye.